Hello and welcome to this video. My name is Dr. Evan Hoffman. I'm a Senior Associate at the Canadian International Institute of Applied Negotiation. And in this video I'll be speaking with Dave Kennedy, who's joining me from Vancouver, British Columbia. Dave is the founder and the president of Strategic Aboriginal Consulting Incorporated. Since 1984, Dave has led or had major involvement in virtually every dimension of Indigenous issues. And since founding his company, Dave has worked on some major private acquisitions and due diligence processes valued at up to $1.4 billion. He's advised on the design of BC Hydro's calls for power, and he's led Indigenous consultation and accommodation processes and negotiations on major capital projects. So it's my great honor to have Dave join us for this video. We're going to be talking mostly about different issues related to stakeholders and community engagement, and I'm looking forward to hearing Dave's views on these matters and having him share his insights. So the first question then that we'll pose is, how do you know that you've identified all of the right stakeholders in Indigenous negotiations?
Well, Evan, thank you for inviting me to participate in this video. There are many things over the last 30-odd years that I've learned, language that has changed over the years. One of the pieces of language that has changed over the years is the use of the term stakeholder for reference to First Nation, Indigenous group, Indigenous government. One of the I call them rookie mistakes that people get in when they first go to a community, a First Nations community, and say, we're here talking to stakeholders. And then they will get a lecture. The lecture will go something like this: we are not stakeholders. The Rod and Gun Club are stakeholders. The recreational users are stakeholders. The mining companies are stakeholders. The First Nations have existing Aboriginal treaty rights, more than just, Rod and Gun Club. So if you want to avoid that lecture, never refer to a First Nation as a stakeholder. So that's my little for the morning. And most will give you that lecture, and you can move on. But sometimes it can be a stopper to a conversation. It tells the other party that you probably haven't done your homework. Mm-hmm. So the answer to your question, which is one of the best ones that people ask, really is there's no substitute for research and homework and background work. To make a trite kind of comparison is the iceberg. You get 90% underwater and 10% above. Negotiations are 10% above the water, and 90% it's just background, tedious, boring work. So you've got to look, depending on the area that you're considering doing some work in, look at existing treaties. There may be some existing, most of Canada has some form of treaty somewhere, and the First Nations named in those. The good news is that more and more First Nations are putting their maps of their traditional territories or treaty areas or areas of interest on mapping and making those available on their websites or through other third-party sites, sometimes are accumulated, I guess, to a general site. The difficulty with mapping First Nations territories is that they are precisely imprecise. In other words, they will tell you exactly to the edge of the territory, but First Nations territories were never mapped. It was, they used an area, in that river to this extent in that season, but that doesn't mean that's the edge of the territory. They probably went past that river, if that's the demarcation line, to hunt, fish, and trap from time to time. So if you've got a project that, is on the west bank of a river, and one of the First Nations territory on the map stops on the east bank of that river, you really want to talk to that First Nation anyway. So don't be misled by the precision that a map appears to give. So it's always better to figure which nations you're pretty certain you need to talk to, and then round that up. You can't go, I'd much rather have a First Nation say to me, thanks for asking, Dave, yeah, not us. Then 6 months later, after 6 months of negotiations and engagement, and maybe you've got an EI filed somewhere, that the First Nation calls up and says, hey, nobody talked to us. This is our territory. Oh, no, your map says you stop at the east side of the river. Yeah, the map is not that precise. So you're much better make it broader and have a First Nation say, yeah, not us, than to start off small and get smacked back. Governments sometimes will provide you with some knowledge about which nations are at play. They're not always correct, but again, it's a series of starting points that you are looking for. And once you then figure, okay, we got these 5 or 6 nations we're pretty sure we need to talk to, and we've rounded up. When you talk to them, ask, so who else here are we missing? You know, we're talking to these guys, those guys, and you guys, are we missing anybody? And you might get an accurate answer. You also probably get this answer that says, oh, you're talking to those guys. This is not their territory. You shouldn't be talking to them. It's our territory. So you get into this discussion about who's primary in an overlap area. Important thing is that you're not the arbiter of that. All you can do is talk to everybody and see what happens. You know, I have had situations where I've had nations say to me on a fairly, 2 or 3 square kilometer project, if you're talking to those guys, we won't talk to you because, the fact that I'm talking to them provides some strength to their claim to the area, and they won't participate. Well, that's your choice, but I'm going to provide information to everybody anyway, and we'll look at it from there. The other piece, and this is one that I know companies find difficult, and governments are not good at. And I work for all sides on these things. I'm not saying one is good or one is bad, but First Nations often will say to you, yeah, we'll talk to you, next Thursday at 2 o'clock or whatever, but, it costs us money to talk to you. It costs us time and effort. We need to bring in maybe an environmental person to look at your reports and whatnot. It's going to cost us money. And it shouldn't cost us money because I'm doing you a favor by talking to you, which is probably true. So providing some capacity funding to the First Nations out of the gate as early as possible. And depending on the scale of your project, you have to scale it for, what you're doing. If you're a little, $100,000 project, then clearly there's not much money lying around for First Nations. If, however, some of the projects I've worked on have been in the $5, $6, $7 billion project, it's kind of hard to say no to $3,000, $4,000, right?
Yeah.
Well, so but to scale and to First Nation really needs the money to decide whether they want to talk to you or not. So if you can get a few $1,000s out the door with as few strings as possible, hey, like here's some good faith, a couple of $1,000 for we'll have a couple of meetings and go from there, and you might have a game, right?
Yes. Okay. Well, I like that. I mean, I took a few notes here. You said basically ask who else should be invited, and I think that's great advice. And you also mentioned better to strategically go wide at the start and then narrow down from there. And then now more recently you're talking about creating conditions favorable for the dialogue and empowering everybody to participate and ensuring there's sufficient capacity. So if dialogue then is one mechanism or tool of engaging what we're not going to call stakeholders now, but the the people involved in the negotiation, maybe we'll just use the term community. What are some of the other tools that you've used to work with communities, to engage communities, and why do you use these tools?
One of the most important tools we have is time, believe it or not. Start talking to nations absolutely as early as possible. You cannot start too early. I've been in situations where I called from a developer saying, next week we're going in to drill some pilot holes to look for some diamonds or something. Can you talk to the First Nation for us? Sorry, no, it's too late, right? And then, others that are, have their EA application, environmental assessment application, all down to the final draft and about to file it, and want to know which First Nation do we send a copy to. That's also too late, because you knew 6, 8, 10 months before then that you were, doing a project that would have attracted an EA process. So as soon as you have, and if you're working from a industry side, as soon as you have publicly announced it, or publicly traded company that we're looking at building a pipeline or a mine or doing some forestry work, you should be out in the community that very day. Project I worked on recently, we knew there'd be a formal announcement the next morning. The night before, we were calling chiefs and councils saying, this is coming. That's a little ambitious, and you're teetering on the edge of offending the market on that. But as early as humanly possible to get out. And this is tying in success of negotiations really relates to the success you have in engagement or consultation. They're not, and they are not the same thing. You will sometimes hear an industry proponent say, oh yeah, but we've been in negotiations with this First Nation for 8 or 9 months, things are going well, blah, 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 so we have been consulting them. Well, legally they haven't been consulting them at all. If that's their only engagement is at a negotiation table, then it isn't consulting. Negotiations are not consultation. It's been tested in courts. I can't name the case for you, but a good lawyer will. You have to have a separate forum with the community. Because, negotiations just to the layperson mean they have an expert or two on either side, community member or two on either side, an industry person or two on the other side, and that's the only people that are talking. It is naive to believe that those 4 people will inform a community of 500 people, and that the 500 people will talk to those 4 people to inform your negotiations. And things that you negotiate may not be the things that you will engage on. Negotiations generally are about, cash money, contracting, maybe some environmental parameters, things like that. Whereas communities, they want to talk about, protection of elders and language and community safety. You wouldn't believe how much time I spent in engagement with communities so that we would write in the formal agreement that the young people or the workers from the camp won't go into town, to protect people, physically protect people. Things that you would never consider part of negotiation become that. So start as early as possible talking to the nations, even before it's all well defined, and that in that way they're working with you organically, moving the thing forward. It's, we thought we were going to build the service road over there. We've talked to you guys. We're going to move it this way instead. And you make it then part of the decision-making process, right? On the back end of things, if you're working from a government or an industry perspective, you need to keep records of everything you do. A friend of mine on a prior project said, if it's not written down, it didn't happen. That is not the same as we need an agenda and formal minutes of meetings and all that kind of garbage. You don't. You spend more time negotiating the agenda and negotiating the notes and the records afterwards than you will actually having a decent discussion. And you won't agree on it, right? And you will be told by the nation in any forum, this is not consultation, because consultation is a legally loaded word. My advice is it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what you call it. It's only important that it's consultation if it's being arbitrated by somebody. If you go into a court or a semi-judicial process, that whether it was consultation that was important, and you won't decide it. You'll present, we did this, they'll present, they did that, and somebody with a gavel will say, it was consultation or it wasn't. You can call it consultation, engagement, information sharing, dog and pony show. It doesn't matter. Just do it. Take feedback, and whenever possible, Incorporate your feedback into your next presentation, to your next iteration of the document. Do these things. We love, this is great, you and I talking by Skype. And there is technology that has helped when possible. You know, human interaction is always better.
Yes.
Always better. And it's important, I think, I've experienced, I'm going into a community, say, representing a pipeline company. Well, the First Nation doesn't know from pipelines. They don't know, much of, there's a lot of work here in BC in the Northeast, and for my client, there's very few pipelines in that area for major works. There's, local ones, but most of the nations across BC that we were working with didn't know what a pipeline was. So just plain information sharing. And they may not trust the message. The First Nation may not trust that we're going to do this stuff in the mining sector, and we're going to do this and do that. But if they trust a messenger, then you might have a game. If they trust me as a person, if they trust my company, then, okay, I've met these people. They seem honest enough, fair enough, been on the land with them. They've taken me on a helicopter tour of the area. We've gone to one of their other mine sites, one of the other reclaimed forestry sites. It's visual. Otherwise, it's just words. And so make it experiential as much as possible.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Those are good advice, good ideas for community engagement. What about this idea, and the next question here, that a lot of negotiations span different levels of government, and do you have any tips on how negotiators can manage that aspect of the process about working across these multiple levels?
Yeah. There are two public governments and one Indigenous government, or maybe 4 or 5 Indigenous governments in negotiations. And while we in conversations will say, government, they really are two different ones, two different sets of interests, two different set of challenges and mandates. So you can't say that the government won't say yes, or the government is giving us a hard time. It's which government? Is it the province? Is it the feds? Is it the territorial government? Is it, some of the modern governments set up like Nunavut or the Niska Nation government? You need to know exactly which your counterparty is. When we're talking about what I'll refer to as public governments, extraordinarily complex mechanisms. They work as fast as they can. I've worked inside government, some of the most dedicated, hardworking people anywhere. But just getting an answer to squeeze out the other end just takes, twice as long as you'd figure it would, right? Take your best estimate, double it, and add your phone number.
Right.
There are a lot of people to be heard from, and part of that is that if a person working in government, if you put yourself in their shoes, and they're working in the Indigenous ministry, the Aboriginal Affairs ministry, well, they don't have any natural turf. They're talking about Aboriginal forestry, Aboriginal mining, Aboriginal oil and gas, Aboriginal child and family services. So they're always on someone else's main turf. I can't make decisions in the Aboriginal Relations Department about, an Aboriginal participation in forestry. Only forestry can. So all those parties have to be on side. So you have to have that main mandate party department on side, and that's often a tough sell, because as much as it's changed over the last 30-some years, doing stuff differently for a mainline department for and with Aboriginal people, that's a new thing, and there's a lot of resistance to that. So the homework we talked about earlier in researching the community, your homework inside with government is just as important. Who am I talking to? What are their mandates? What are their legislative timelines? And are there any? I've seen situations where simple cutting permit applications, which have a 90-day, we will issue this cutting permit to you for 90 days if nothing bad happens, written in law and regulation, that the delegate decision maker just wasn't comfortable making a decision, and they put it in their desk drawer for 4+ years.
Wow.
It's in the US they call it a pocket veto. It just goes away.
Yeah.
Because if the person is to make a decision to say yes, then maybe the First Nation's on their back. If they say no, then the forestry company's unhappy. So just make it go away. So you got to find out how that happens and what you can do about it. It took some doing to get those things sped up, but knowing the different pockets in government are really, really important. The other thing is there are two distinct governments, and sometimes you will have at the table, say First Nation, Government 1 and Government 2, and the two governments say, we'll just go aside and talk amongst ourselves, come back and talk to you, we'll get our act together. You shouldn't allow them to do it. Good faith negotiations assumes no collusion amongst parties. How would, if I was representing the provincial government, feel if the First Nation and the feds went to a side room and came back and worked out a deal and then came talk to me? I wouldn't like it very much. It does happen in modern tripartite negotiations. It really, really should. There are individual governments with their own individual legislative and constitutional abilities. So you really shouldn't allow them, if you're a First Nation, to, it's not, just comparing notes. They're colluding. Sorry, but you are. So don't let that happen. Have all the discussions at the open table. Doesn't mean you can't have a side table with one person from each party trying to knock the edges off an issue, but you should never allow not everybody to be participating in discussions, substantial discussions. If take a phone call, we can be there at 10. Can you be there at 10? Yeah, fine, right? It's not exactly ex parte, but don't allow it to happen in what ought to be real tripartite or multilateral negotiations. So if you're working from government, you got to work to keep the other line departments, line ministries on side all the time, and don't let them, lose their nerve. So you got to keep reassuring them, keep them on side, tell them that things are changing, get them to weigh in. The same way with the community, you keep them involved and engaged by constantly updating and revising and showing where changes are being made and having their influence shown in those. You got to do the same thing with the line departments. They would argue that no, we're just professionally sharing information. No, we're hand-holding. We're walking you through the process.
So it sounds like a lot of that is really about relationships in some ways, and then building the relationships and maintaining them throughout the process.
It's all about, to paraphrase Ronald Reagan, it's about relationships, dummy. It really is. Negotiations, we put all this, great beauty around it, and we close the door, and we lock the door, and we don't talk about it outside because we're all in non-disclosure agreements and whatnot. But it's really about working on trust inside that room that is, bolstered by the trust outside the room between the parties in their community and government engagements. Mm-hmm. So one thing I'd just like to circle back to, if you don't mind, on the community and the negotiation piece. It's more than just community, having a meeting at the town hall with a dog and pony show and a Q&A. You really want to get people as directly involved as possible, the community folks. So if you're out on the land, you're planning to do some, say, stream assessments, or as a friend of mine called it, bugs and bunny assessments. You're counting flowers and bugs and bunnies and stuff like that. Or especially if you have your archaeological people out in the field, have First Nations folk with you. Have them with you. They will work with you. They will tell you stories. Your archaeologists, your Western scientists, if you will inform and provide more depth and color. And also, then when you go back and file with government or the regulator, here's our archaeological assessment, and the First Nation says, well, that's not exactly right, because there's a special thing over here and a spiritual thing there you would never see because it's not a thing that you can actually point at. You're uninformed. Well, if you have them in the field with you and you provide them with resources to provide maybe their own traditional ecological knowledge information on resource and land use and things like that, then you have more greater depth to your report, and they are directly and personally involved in what's going on. And if you get to the point of building something or starting a project, it's really great to have environmental or elder monitors while you're in the field. Clients that I work with, governments I work with, when they get a shovel in their hands, they do good work. But if First Nations don't see you doing it, so if you have a respected person from the community, and you go through all the safety stuff, the WCB, you got to go to tail board meetings, cover off whatever you need to there, to see what you're doing and how you're doing it. And when they report back to the community that, these guys from XYZ company, they ain't throwing the garbage around, they're not lighting diesel fires or spitting, they're doing good work, that really resonates and builds the love that you really want to have and maintain long-term for the relationship. Because you're going to be there for a long time. You're going to be there for a long time. So, sorry, I'm going to circle back to that.
No, that's fine. Thank you for sharing that. Well, my last question for you then is just whether you have any other tips you'd like to share, any advice or lessons that you've learned from your many years of experience?
Yeah, I'll go back to it again. Share every bit of information that you possibly can with First Nation. And keep it updated. Your plans will change, your design will change, your road routes, your pipeline route, or route if you're in the States will change. Your timing will change. Update people, because if you haven't updated the communities about your changes and adaptations, then they've been consulted about version 2 and you're working on version 27. So they weren't consulted on version 27, they were consulted on version 2. So you've wasted a lot of time by not talking to them. Because they'll say, oh, hang on, we didn't see that one before. This is brand new to us. And never let anything be, nothing should ever go to a First Nation that they haven't seen before or heard about before.
Yeah.
So if industry, I'm going to share it with you, with the nation, before I give it to government. The government will give it to them. They will refer it out, when it's finally, but I want the First Nation to see it, weigh in on it, before it goes into the ground. Keep the entire community engaged. Like I said, at negotiations, you'll have the chiefs and or lawyers and or advisors, usually maybe a community person or two in the little room. But they ain't it. You also got to have different people. You got to have two sets of people in your organization, your negotiator types and your engagement types. Also at the same time in the field, keeping the community engaged as much as possible. It's a personal, professional relationship you need to keep, so it's about the relationship dummy. It's really, really important that they trust a messenger. This is really hard work. Negotiations in my field are really hard. I'm certain in the fields, Evan, that you work in, it ain't easy. It's very specialized. It's very frustrating. It takes a lot more time. It takes a lot more money, a lot more effort, and for industry and government often, a lot more soul searching than they thought they'd have to. They have to think about it a lot more deeply than they ever expected that they would. It takes a while, and you got to be prepared. This is not going to be easy. Even with a cooperative First Nation who's done this before, it's never easy. So while this sounds self-serving, don't be afraid to ask for help. In the country, there's maybe 24 of us who are considered experts in this area, the higher end experts, but there are a lot of other people who do really good work here. And just because you're feeling out of your element doesn't mean all is lost. There are people who've been through this a lot before, and not that we got to come in and spend the next 2 years being the guy at negotiations, but to bring in somebody for a week or two to help you along some of the too hard pile, or to coach you on mandates or something like that. It's a really good use of time and money to say, listen, I'm out of my element here. I'm good at this, but I'm getting all these kind of reactions. The other piece, and with all apologies to all of my friends who are lawyers, whenever possible, avoid a lawyer-to-lawyer negotiation. Lawyers are support mechanisms in negotiation. If they are the face of your negotiations, in almost all cases, it become a much more difficult, evidence-based, he said, she said negotiation. And I've actually had a lawyer I saw last week at a symposium that, I think we want to call you, Dave, because we're in some negotiations, and our party sends us as lawyers, or their party sends their lawyer, and it becomes that kind of discussion, but then having the kind of interaction that non-lawyers can actually have. So not that lawyers are bad negotiators, but they are different because of what they do. You need to have them, you need to have their advice, things go south, you really need to have them, and you need to have and to write up all the agreements to make sure that they're done, that you're actually agreeing to what you think you're agreeing to. But having them as the facing of the negotiations, it doesn't usually work out so well. That's my refrain there.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Dave. I see that we're right on time here. So thanks for sharing all of your insights with us today. Thank you for spending time on this video. And I'll put a link to your website in the description of the video so people can follow up with any questions and to seek more information. So I'm just going to stop the recording now.